My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I never thought I'd be sitting in the back row of St. Mary's Cathedral on a gray October morning in Chicago, watching the funeral of the man who changed my life forever. The wooden pew felt cold against my back as I tried to make myself invisible, pulling my black coat tighter around my shoulders. The autumn wind rattled the stained glass windows, and I could hear the distant rumble of the L train carrying people to their normal Tuesday routines while I sat here, drowning in memories I'd tried so hard to bury. Robert Harrison had been my high school English teacher 15 years ago, but he was so much more than that. He was the person who saw something in me when no one else did, not even myself. As I watched his family filing into the front rows, dressed in their expensive black suits and designer dresses, I felt the familiar sting of not belonging. His widow, Patricia, had made it clear through her cold stare when I walked in that I wasn't welcome here. His adult children, Michael and Jennifer, had inherited their mother's disdain for anyone they deemed beneath their social status. I remember walking into Mr. Harrison's classroom for the first time as a 16-year-old junior. I was the kid from the wrong side of town, wearing thrift store clothes and carrying a backpack held together with duct tape. My mom worked 2 jobs just to keep our tiny apartment in Pilsen, and my dad had been out of the picture since I was 12. Most teachers looked right through me, but Mr. Harrison saw something different. "Sarah," he had said after class that first day, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners, "I read your essay about your neighborhood. You have a gift for storytelling. Have you ever considered writing seriously?" I almost laughed. Kids like me didn't become writers. We worked at the factory, or if we were lucky, we might make it through community college and get an office job. But Mr. Harrison didn't see it that way. He started staying after school to help me with my writing, lending me books that opened up worlds I never knew existed, and slowly, carefully, he helped me believe that maybe I could be something more than what everyone expected. The organ began playing Amazing Grace, and I felt tears threatening to spill over. I looked around the cathedral, taking in the sea of faces I didn't recognize. Colleagues from the private school where he'd taught after leaving our public high school, members of his country club, neighbors from his affluent Lincoln Park neighborhood. I was probably the only person here who remembered him from Jefferson High, where he'd spent the first 20 years of his teaching career before moving on to bigger and better things. The priest began the service, speaking about Robert's contributions to education and his dedication to his family. I closed my eyes and let my mind wander back to those afternoons in room 237, where Mr. Harrison would sit across from me at his desk, red pen in hand, helping me polish my rough drafts until they gleamed. "You have something important to say, Sarah," he would tell me. "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." He helped me apply for scholarships, wrote recommendation letters that I'm sure were far more generous than I deserved, and even drove me to college interviews when my mom couldn't get time off work. When I got accepted to Northwestern on a full scholarship, he was the first person I called. "I knew you could do it," he said, and I could hear the pride in his voice. "You're going to change the world with your words." But life had other plans. My freshman year at Northwestern, my mom got sick, really sick. The medical bills piled up, and I had to make a choice. I dropped out and came home to take care of her, working whatever jobs I could find to keep us afloat. Mr. Harrison was disappointed, I could tell, but he never made me feel like a failure. "Sometimes life asks us to take detours," he said when I called to tell him. "That doesn't mean you can't still reach your destination." The years passed quickly after that. Mom fought her illness for 3 years before losing the battle. I stayed in Chicago, working as a waitress at a downtown restaurant, still writing in my spare time, but never quite finding the courage to submit anything for publication. I'd run into Mr. Harrison occasionally at the grocery store or on the street, and he'd always ask about my writing, always encouraging me to keep going. The last time I saw him was about 2 years ago, at Navy Pier. He was with his grandson, a boy who looked to be about 8 years old, and they were feeding seagulls near the water. I almost didn't approach him. I felt embarrassed about how my life had turned out, how I'd squandered the opportunities he'd helped me earn. But he spotted me first. "Sarah," he called out, his face lighting up with genuine pleasure. "How wonderful to see you." We talked for about 20 minutes while his grandson played nearby. He told me about his retirement, his volunteer work at the literacy center, his pride in his grandchildren. I told him about my job at the restaurant, carefully avoiding any mention of my writing. But somehow, he knew. "Are you still writing?" he asked gently. I shrugged. "Sometimes. Nothing important." He gave me that look, the same look he'd given me in high school when he knew I was selling myself short. "Everything you write is important, Sarah. Don't forget that." As I sat in the back of the cathedral, watching his family receive condolences from the other mourners, I realized that Mr. Harrison had been the one constant source of belief in my life. Even when I'd stopped believing in myself, he'd never stopped believing in me. The service continued, with readings from his children and a eulogy from the headmaster of the private school where he'd finished his career. They spoke about his dedication to academic excellence, his love for literature, his commitment to preparing students for Ivy League universities. But they didn't mention the kid from Pilsen who he'd stayed late to help, or the dozens of other students from Jefferson High who probably owed their success to his unwavering faith in their potential. As the ceremony drew to a close, I prepared to slip out quietly. I had paid my respects, said my silent goodbye, and I didn't want to cause any uncomfortable moments with his family. But as I stood to leave, I heard my name being called. "Excuse me, are you Sarah Mitchell?" I turned to see a young man in a dark suit approaching me. He had Mr. Harrison's kind eyes and gentle smile, though his hair was darker and his build more athletic. "Yes," I said uncertainly. "I'm David Harrison, Robert's nephew. Could I speak with you for a moment?" I glanced toward the front of the church, where the family was still receiving visitors. "I don't think your family would appreciate—" "Please," he interrupted gently. "It's important. Uncle Robert asked me to find you if anything happened to him." My heart skipped a beat. What? David reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope. My name was written on it in Mr. Harrison's familiar handwriting. My hands shook as I took it from him. "He gave this to me about 6 months ago," David explained. "He said if anything happened to him, I should make sure you got it. He said you might not come to the funeral, but if you did, you'd probably be sitting in the back." I stared at the envelope, afraid to open it. Mr. Harrison had been thinking about me, even at the end, even when I'd been too proud and too ashamed to stay in touch. "He talked about you a lot," David continued. "About how proud he was of you, how you were one of his favorite students. He said you had a gift that the world needed to see." Tears began to fall freely now, and I didn't care who saw them. "I let him down," I whispered. "I had all these opportunities, and I wasted them." David smiled sadly. "That's not what he thought. He said you were exactly where you needed to be, and that when you were ready, you'd know what to do." I looked down at the envelope in my hands. Whatever was inside, I knew it would change everything. Mr. Harrison had always had a way of seeing the path forward, even when I couldn't see it myself. "There's something else," David said quietly. "He left instructions. He wanted you to have something from his study. Would you be willing to come by the house tomorrow? The family will be busy with other things, but I could meet you there." I nodded, not trusting my voice. As David walked away, I clutched the envelope to my chest and made my way out of the cathedral. The October wind bit at my cheeks as I stood on the steps, watching the hearse pull away. Mr. Harrison was gone, but somehow I felt his presence more strongly than I had in years. I didn't open the envelope right away. Instead, I walked to the nearest coffee shop and ordered a cup of coffee, finding a quiet corner table where I could read his final message in privacy. The envelope was heavier than I expected, and when I opened it, I found 3 items: a folded letter, a small brass key, and a newspaper clipping. The letter was written in his careful handwriting. "My dear Sarah, if you're reading this, then I've gone on to whatever comes next, and I hope you found your way to my funeral despite what I'm sure was a less than warm welcome from Patricia and the children. I've always known you had too much class to let their snobbery stop you from saying goodbye. I want you to know that you were never a disappointment to me. Life took you on a different path than we originally planned, but that doesn't mean it was the wrong path. Every experience you've had, every struggle you've faced, has been preparing you for something greater. I've been following your writing, you know. That piece you published in the Tribune's community section last year about your mother's illness was beautiful and heartbreaking and powerful. You may not submit your work often, but when you do, it moves people. That's the mark of a true writer. The key is to a safety deposit box at First National Bank on Michigan Avenue, Box 247. Inside, you'll find something that I hope will help you understand how much you've meant to me over the years and how much faith I still have in your future. Don't let fear hold you back any longer, Sarah. The world needs your voice. With love and endless belief in you, Robert Harrison P.S. The newspaper clipping is from the Chicago Sun-Times. They're looking for a new feature writer for their human interest stories. I may have mentioned your name to someone who has influence there. Consider it a nudge from beyond. I set the letter down with trembling hands and looked at the newspaper clipping. It was a job posting for a staff writer position at the Sun-Times, focusing on community stories and human interest pieces, the kind of writing I'd always dreamed of doing. As I sat there in the coffee shop, surrounded by the afternoon bustle of downtown Chicago, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: hope. Mr. Harrison had never stopped believing in me, never stopped watching over me, never stopped trying to help me find my way. Even in death, he was still teaching me, still pushing me to be better than I thought I could be. Tomorrow, I would go to his house and discover what he'd left for me in that safety deposit box. Tomorrow, I would start figuring out how to honor his faith in me. But today, I would sit here with his letter and remember the man who had changed my life simply by seeing something in me that I couldn't see in myself. The rain started to fall as I walked home to my small apartment, but for the first time in years, I felt like I was walking towards something instead of away from it. Mr. Harrison's final lesson was already beginning to sink in. Sometimes the most important journeys begin with the courage to believe in ourselves the way others believe in us. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm, which was unusual for me. I'd been working the night shift at Rossetti's Italian restaurant for the past 3 years, and I was used to sleeping until noon. But today felt different. Today, I had somewhere important to be. I showered and put on my best dress, a navy blue sheath that I'd bought for job interviews that never led anywhere. As I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, applying makeup with more care than usual, I thought about what Mr. Harrison might have left for me. The safety deposit box key felt warm in my palm, like it was carrying some of his energy with it. The Harrison house was in Lincoln Park, on a tree-lined street where the median home price was probably more than I'd earn in 10 years. I'd looked up the address online and spent a few minutes on Google Street View, trying to prepare myself for what I'd find. The reality was even more impressive than the photos. It was a 3-story Victorian mansion with a wraparound porch and a perfectly manicured garden, even in October. David Harrison was waiting for me on the front steps, looking much more relaxed than he had at the funeral. He was maybe 35, with brown hair that was just beginning to show gray at the temples, and kind eyes that reminded me so much of his uncle. "Sarah, thank you for coming," he said, standing up as I approached. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," I admitted. "This is a beautiful home." He nodded, but I could see something sad in his expression. Uncle Robert loved this place. He spent hours in his study, reading and writing. He said it was his sanctuary. David led me through the front door into a spacious foyer with dark wood floors and a crystal chandelier. The house smelled like lemon polish and old books, and I could hear muffled voices coming from what I assumed was the kitchen. "The family's dealing with some estate matters," David explained, noticing my glance toward the voices. "But they won't bother us. Uncle Robert's study is upstairs." We climbed a curved staircase to the second floor, and David opened a door at the end of the hallway. Mr. Harrison's study was exactly what I'd imagined. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a massive oak desk positioned near a window that looked out over the garden, and a leather chair that still seemed to hold the impression of his body. "This is where he spent most of his time after he retired," David said softly. "He was working on something, a book, I think. He never talked about it much, but I'd often find him here late at night, typing away on his computer." I walked around the room, taking in the details. The books were organized by subject: poetry, classic literature, American history, writing guides. There were framed photos on the desk, his wife, his children, his grandchildren. And there, in a simple silver frame, was a photo I recognized. It was from my high school graduation, and I was standing next to Mr. Harrison, both of us smiling broadly. I was wearing the cap and gown that he'd helped me order, and he was wearing the same proud expression he'd had when I'd called to tell him about my Northwestern scholarship. "He kept this here?" I asked, picking up the frame. David nodded. "He said you were one of his greatest success stories. He used to tell people that you were proof that good teaching could change lives." I set the photo down carefully, my vision blurring with tears. "I need to go to the bank first," I said, "to see what's in the safety deposit box. Would you mind waiting here?" "Of course. Take your time." The First National Bank was only a few blocks away, and the October air was crisp and clean as I walked. I'd been to this bank before, It was where I'd opened my first checking account when I started working at the restaurant. But I'd never been to the safety deposit box area. The bank employee, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, led me to a small room where she used both my key and the bank's key to open box 247. Inside was a manila envelope, thick and heavy, with my name written on it in Mr. Harrison's handwriting. "Take your time," the woman said, leaving me alone with whatever Mr. Harrison had left for me. I opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside, I found a stack of papers, what looked like photocopies of letters, and a small leather journal. The first paper was a letter addressed to me, dated 6 months ago. "Dear Sarah, if you're reading this, then David has done as I asked and made sure you received my message. I hope you found the courage to open this box and discover what I've been saving for you. Over the years, I've kept track of your writing. Every piece you've published, every letter to the editor, every story you've submitted to literary magazines, even the ones that were rejected. I've saved them all, and I want you to see what I see when I look at your work. You are a writer, Sarah. Not someone who writes as a hobby, not someone who has potential to be a writer someday, but a writer, right now, today. Your voice is unique, your perspective is valuable, and your stories have the power to change lives." I've also included copies of letters I've written over the years, to editors, to literary agents, to publishers, recommending your work. Some of these letters were sent, others were written but never mailed because I didn't want to interfere with your journey unless you asked me to. But I want you to know that I've always been your advocate, even when you didn't know it. The journal contains story ideas, writing exercises, and thoughts about your work that I've been collecting for years. Consider it a final lesson from your old teacher. There's one more thing in this box, Sarah. It's a cashier's check for $50,000. This is not charity. It's an investment. I've been saving money for years with the hope that someday you'd be ready to take the leap and write full-time. I want you to use this money to give yourself the gift of time. Time to write, time to submit your work, time to build the career you were meant to have. I know you'll probably hesitate to accept this. You've always been proud, and you've always insisted on making your own way. But sometimes, accepting help is the bravest thing we can do. Let me do this for you, Sarah. Let me give you the same gift you gave me, the knowledge that my life made a difference. Write your stories, share your voice, change the world, one word at a time. With love and endless faith in you, Robert Harrison. I stared at the letter, then at the cashier's check that was paper-clipped to the back. $50,000. Enough to live on for a year, maybe 2 if I was careful. Enough to quit my job at the restaurant and focus on writing full-time. I picked up the journal and began to read. Mr. Harrison had been documenting my writing journey for years, analyzing my published pieces, suggesting ways to improve my craft, and recording ideas for stories I might want to tell. He'd written detailed notes about my strengths and weaknesses as a writer, and I could see how much thought he'd put into helping me grow. One entry, dated just 3 months ago, particularly caught my attention. Sarah submitted a piece to the Sun-Times about the closing of the community center in Pilsen. It was rejected, but the writing was powerful and the story was important. I called my former student, Marcus Thompson, who's now an editor there. He said they liked the piece, but felt it needed more personal perspective. Sarah has a tendency to hide behind journalism when she should be letting her personal voice shine through. I think she's afraid of being vulnerable on the page, but that vulnerability is what makes her writing special. I read through more entries, each one showing the depth of Mr. Harrison's attention to my work and his understanding of who I was as a writer. He'd been my unofficial mentor all these years, even when I thought I was struggling alone. The photocopied letters were even more revealing. Letter after letter to editors, praising my work and suggesting that they give me a chance. Most were never sent, but a few were, and I recognized some of the publications that had accepted my pieces over the years. I'd always wondered why certain editors had been so encouraging, why they'd taken time to give me detailed feedback even when they rejected my work. Now I knew. I sat in that small bank room for over an hour, reading through everything Mr. Harrison had left for me. By the time I was finished, I felt like I'd been carrying a heavy weight for years without realizing it. And now that weight had been lifted. He'd seen me more clearly than I'd seen myself, and he'd been working behind the scenes to help me succeed. When I returned to the Harrison house, David was waiting in the study, reading one of his uncle's books. "How did it go?" he asked. I told him about the contents of the safety deposit box, about the money and the letters in the journal. David listened carefully, nodding occasionally. "That sounds like Uncle Robert," he said when I finished. "He was always doing things like that, helping people without them knowing it. He paid for my college tuition when my parents couldn't afford it, and I didn't find out until years later." "I don't know if I can accept the money," I said. "It feels like too much." David smiled. "He told me you'd say that. He said to tell you that the money isn't about charity. It's about investment. He invested in your education when you were young, and he wants to invest in your career now. He said you've already proven you can write. Now you just need the time and space to do it." I walked over to the window and looked out at the garden. The October leaves were brilliant shades of red and gold, and I could see a small fountain in the center of the yard where birds were drinking. "There's something else," David said. "Uncle Robert wanted you to have his desk." I turned around, surprised. "His desk?" "He said you'd need a proper writing space. He spent 40 years grading papers and writing lesson plans at that desk, and he said it was time for it to be used for something creative." I ran my hand over the smooth surface of the oak desk, imagining Mr. Harrison sitting here, working on his mysterious book project. "What happened to the book he was writing?" David's expression grew thoughtful. "That's the thing, we can't find it. He was definitely working on something, but there's no manuscript on his computer, no printed pages in his files. It's like it just disappeared." I thought about this as I examined the desk more closely. It was a beautiful piece of furniture with multiple drawers and compartments. As I opened one of the smaller drawers, I felt something unusual, a hidden compartment that wasn't immediately visible. "David, look at this." He came over as I worked to open the hidden compartment. Inside, I found a flash drive and a note that simply said, "For Sarah," the story I always wanted to tell. We looked at each other with excitement. David immediately went to his uncle's computer and inserted the flash drive. After a moment, a document appeared on the screen, titled, "The Teacher's Gift, a Story of Believing in Others." As I began to read, I realized that Mr. Harrison had been writing about me, about us, about the relationship between a teacher and a student, and how that relationship had shaped both of our lives. He'd written about my struggles in high school, my scholarship to Northwestern, my decision to leave school to care for my mother, and my ongoing battle to find my voice as a writer. But it wasn't just my story. It was his story too. He'd written about how teaching me had reminded him why he'd become an educator in the first place, how my determination had inspired him to keep believing in the power of education, and how watching me grow as a writer had been one of the greatest joys of his career. The manuscript was about 200 pages long, and as I read through it, I felt a complex mix of emotions. I was honored that he'd thought my story was worth telling, but I was also overwhelmed by the responsibility. He'd entrusted me with his final work, and I knew that somehow I needed to make sure it reached the world. "He wanted you to have this," David said, as if reading my thoughts. "He said in his will that if anything happened to him, you should be the one to decide what to do with his writing." I sat in Mr. Harrison's chair, looking at his manuscript on the computer screen. The writing was beautiful, thoughtful, and deeply personal. He'd captured our relationship with honesty and grace, showing how two people from different worlds could impact each other's lives in profound ways. "I know what I need to do," I said finally. "I need to finish this story." David looked puzzled. "But it seems complete." "It's complete up to about 2 years ago," I explained. "But the story isn't over yet. He wrote about believing in me, about having faith that I'd eventually find my way. But he didn't get to see how the story ends. I need to write that ending." I spent the rest of the afternoon in Mr. Harrison's study, reading through his manuscript and making notes. By the time I left, I had a plan. I would quit my job at the restaurant, use Mr. Harrison's gift to support myself while I wrote, and finish the story he'd started. I would also apply for the position at the Sun-Times, using his recommendation and my own growing confidence as a writer. As David helped me load the desk into a moving truck he'd arranged, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: excitement about the future. Mr. Harrison had given me more than money and furniture. He'd given me permission to believe in myself the way he'd always believed in me. "Thank you," I said to David as we stood on the front porch, "for everything, for finding me at the funeral, for helping me understand what your uncle wanted." "Thank you for being important to him," David replied. "He talked about you more than you know. You made him proud to be a teacher." As I drove home that evening, Mr. Harrison's desk secured in the truck behind me, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. It had been 15 years since I'd first walked into his classroom, and in all that time, he'd never stopped believing in me. Now it was time for me to stop disappointing him and start living up to the faith he'd always had in my potential. The story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. 3 weeks later, I was sitting at Mr. Harrison's desk in my small apartment, surrounded by the controlled chaos of a working writer. I'd rearranged my entire living space to accommodate the massive oak desk, and it dominated my studio apartment like a beautiful, imposing reminder of the task ahead of me. I'd quit my job at Rossetti's 2 weeks ago, and I was still adjusting to the freedom of setting my own schedule. For the first time in years, I could wake up when I wanted, write when I felt inspired, and think about my work without the constant pressure of needing to be somewhere else. The manuscript Mr. Harrison had left me was open on the computer screen, and I'd been working on the final chapters, the part of the story he hadn't lived to see. It was harder than I'd expected, writing about my own life with the same honesty and insight he'd brought to the earlier chapters. But I was determined to honor his work by finishing it properly. I'd also been working on my application for the Sun-Times position. The job posting had asked for writing samples, and I'd spent days going through my old work, trying to select pieces that showed my range and potential. I'd included the essay about my mother's illness that Mr. Harrison had mentioned in his letter, along with the piece about the community center closing and a feature story I'd written about a local artist who created murals in underprivileged neighborhoods. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. I glanced at the caller ID and saw a number I didn't recognize with a Chicago area code. Hello? Is this Sarah Mitchell? The voice was professional, friendly, with just a hint of curiosity. Yes, this is Sarah. This is Marcus Thompson from the Chicago Sun-Times. I'm calling about your application for the staff writer position. Would you have time to come in for an interview this week? My heart started racing. Yes, absolutely. When would be convenient? How about Thursday at 2 p.m.? We're located downtown on North Wabash. Thursday at 2 p.m. works perfectly. Thank you so much for calling. After I hung up, I sat there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Marcus Thompson. That was the name I'd seen in Mr. Harrison's journal, the editor he'd called about my Pilsen Community Center piece. I wondered if Mr. Harrison's recommendation had played a role in getting me this interview, or if my work had finally spoken for itself. I spent the next few days preparing for the interview, researching the Sun-Times, reading recent articles by their feature writers, and practicing answers to potential questions. But mostly, I worked on finishing Mr. Harrison's manuscript because I knew that completing his story was more important than any job interview. The final chapters were the hardest to write. I had to be honest about my struggles, my failures, my years of feeling lost and directionless. But I also had to show how Mr. Harrison's faith in me had been a constant source of strength, even when I hadn't realized it. I wrote about the night my mother died, how I'd sat in the hospital room feeling completely alone, and how I'd found an old letter from Mr. Harrison in my purse, a note he'd written when I'd first left Northwestern, telling me that sometimes the most important journeys take us through difficult terrain, but that I had the strength to handle whatever came next. I wrote about the years of working at the restaurant, how I'd come home exhausted but still sit at my kitchen table, writing stories on napkins and scraps of paper because I couldn't afford a computer. I wrote about the rejection letters, the self-doubt, the times I'd almost given up entirely. But I also wrote about the small victories, the first piece I'd published in a community newsletter, the letter to the editor that had sparked responses from other readers, the feature story that had led to a follow-up assignment. I wrote about how each small success had felt like a message from Mr. Harrison, reminding me that he'd been right to believe in me. Thursday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical Chicago October weather. I put on my best suit, a charcoal gray outfit I'd bought for interviews years ago, and took the L downtown to the Sun-Times building. The newsroom was exactly what I'd imagined, a bustling open space filled with desks, computers, and people moving with purpose. The energy was infectious, and I could feel my excitement building as I waited for Marcus Thompson to meet me. When he appeared, I was surprised by how young he looked, maybe 40, with curly brown hair and glasses that gave him an intellectual air. He was wearing a rumpled button-down shirt and jeans, and he had the slightly frazzled look of someone who'd been working under deadline pressure. "Sarah, thank you for coming in," he said, shaking my hand with a firm grip. "I'm Marcus. Why don't we go to my office?" His office was small but comfortable, with windows that looked out over the Chicago River. The walls were covered with framed newspaper clippings and awards, and his desk was covered with the organized chaos of a working editor. "I've been looking at your work," he said, settling into his chair. "I have to say, I'm impressed. Your writing has a real authenticity to it, a personal voice that's hard to find these days." "Thank you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've always believed that the best stories come from personal experience and genuine emotion." Marcus nodded. "Tell me about the piece you wrote about the community center closing. That one really caught my attention." I explained the story behind the article, how I'd grown up using that community center, how it had been a safe haven for kids in my neighborhood, and how its closing had affected the entire community. "You have a gift for showing the human impact of larger issues," Marcus said. "That's exactly what we're looking for in this position. We want someone who can find the personal stories behind the headlines." The interview continued for about an hour, covering my background, my writing process, and my goals as a journalist. Marcus asked thoughtful questions, and I found myself relaxing as we talked. He seemed genuinely interested in my perspective and my experiences. Near the end of the interview, Marcus leaned back in his chair and studied me carefully. "Can I ask you something? Robert Harrison called me about 6 months ago, recommending your work. He said you were one of the most talented writers he'd ever taught. How well did you know him?" I felt my throat tighten with emotion. Mr. Harrison was my high school English teacher. He was also my mentor, my advocate, and probably the person who believed in me most in this world. He died a few weeks ago. Marcus's expression softened. "I'm sorry for your loss. He spoke very highly of you. He said you had a unique voice and that you deserved a chance to reach a larger audience. He was always my biggest supporter," I said, "even when I didn't deserve it. From what I can see, you've always deserved it," Marcus said. "I'd like to offer you the position, Sarah. The salary is $45,000 to start, with benefits and opportunities for advancement. You'd be covering human interest stories, community issues, and features that highlight the experiences of everyday people. Are you interested?" I felt like I might cry right there in his office. "Yes, absolutely. I'm very interested." "Great. Can you start Monday?" I nodded, not trusting my voice to speak. After we shook hands and I'd filled out the necessary paperwork, I walked out of the Sun-Times building in a daze. I had a job, a real job, doing the kind of writing I'd always dreamed of doing. I called David Harrison from the sidewalk outside the building. "Sarah, how did it go?" "I got the job," I said, and I could hear the smile in my voice. "I start Monday." "Uncle Robert would be so proud," David said. "He always said you'd make it eventually." That weekend, I worked furiously to finish the manuscript. I wrote about getting the job at the Sun-Times, about how Mr. Harrison's faith in me had finally been vindicated, about the bittersweet feeling of achieving a dream he wouldn't be here to see. The final chapter was the hardest to write because I had to try to capture what Mr. Harrison had meant to me and what his loss had taught me about the importance of believing in others. I wrote about how his death had forced me to confront my own fears and insecurities, and how his final gift had given me the courage to step into the life I was meant to live. I finished the manuscript on Sunday night, exactly 4 weeks after his funeral. The completed story was 347 pages long, and I felt both exhausted and exhilarated as I typed the final sentence. I'd managed to capture not just the facts of our relationship, but the emotional truth of what it meant to have someone believe in you unconditionally. Monday morning, I walked into the Sun-Times newsroom as a staff writer for the first time. I was assigned a small desk in the features department, and I spent my first day meeting my colleagues and learning the systems I'd need to navigate as a professional journalist. My first assignment was to write a profile of a local teacher who'd been named Chicago Educator of the Year. As I sat in Maria Santos's classroom at Roosevelt High School, watching her work with her students, I couldn't help but think about Mr. Harrison. Maria had the same passion, the same ability to see potential in kids that others might overlook. "What made you want to become a teacher?" I asked her during our interview. Maria smiled. "I had a teacher in high school who changed my life. She saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. She convinced me that I could go to college, that I could make something of myself. I became a teacher because I wanted to do that for other kids." I knew exactly what she meant. As I wrote Maria's story that night, I realized that Mr. Harrison's influence was rippling outward in ways he'd never know. He'd inspired me, I was telling Maria's story, and Maria was inspiring her students. It was a beautiful cycle of belief and encouragement. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into my work at the Sun-Times. I wrote about a janitor who'd been secretly paying for students' school supplies, a grandmother who'd turned her backyard into a community garden, and a group of teenagers who'd started a program to teach elderly people how to use smartphones. Each story reminded me of the lessons Mr. Harrison had taught me about the power of human connection and the importance of giving people a voice. I found myself thinking about him every time I interviewed someone, every time I sat down to write, every time I tried to find the heart of a story. 3 months into my new job, I decided it was time to do something with Mr. Harrison's manuscript. I'd been carrying it around like a secret, not sure what to do with it, but I knew he'd written it for a reason, and I felt obligated to try to get it published. I spent my evenings researching literary agents who specialized in memoirs and nonfiction. I wrote query letters, prepared synopsis summaries, and submitted the manuscript to a dozen different agents. Most of the responses were polite rejections, but a few agents expressed interest and asked to see the full manuscript. One agent, Jennifer Walsh from a respected literary agency in New York, called me on a Thursday afternoon in February. "Sarah, I've read your manuscript about your relationship with Robert Harrison, and I have to say, I'm deeply moved by it. This is exactly the kind of story that needs to be told right now. There's so much cynicism about education and teachers, and this book shows the profound impact that one dedicated educator can have on a student's life." I felt my heart racing. Does that mean you're interested in representing it? I'd love to represent it. I think I know exactly which publishers would be interested in this story. Are you available to discuss the details? Over the next hour, Jennifer outlined her vision for the book. She thought it could reach both educators and general readers, and she believed there was a market for stories about the power of mentorship and belief in others. "There's one thing I'd like to suggest," Jennifer said. "I think the book would be even stronger if you included some perspectives from other people who knew Robert Harrison. Maybe some of his other students, some of his colleagues. It would show that your experience wasn't unique, that he had this kind of impact on many people." I love the idea. Over the next few weeks, I reached out to people who'd known Mr. Harrison throughout his career. I interviewed former students who'd gone on to become doctors, lawyers, teachers, and artists. I spoke with colleagues who'd worked with him at both Jefferson High School and the private school where he'd finished his career. What I discovered was that my story was far from unique. Mr. Harrison had been quietly changing lives for 40 years, always seeing potential where others saw problems, always believing in students who'd stopped believing in themselves. One former student, now a successful pediatric surgeon, told me, "Mr. Harrison was the first person who ever told me I was smart. I was a kid from the projects who barely spoke English, and he saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. He changed the entire trajectory of my life." Another student, who'd become a social worker, said, "I was going through a really rough time at home, and Mr. Harrison noticed. He never pried, but he made sure I knew that someone cared about me. That attention literally saved my life." The expanded manuscript was 450 pages long, and it painted a picture of a man who dedicated his life to lifting up others. Jennifer was thrilled with the revisions, and she submitted the book to publishers in March. The response was immediate and overwhelming. 5 publishers expressed interest, and Jennifer set up an auction for the rights to the book. The bidding was competitive, and ultimately, a major publisher offered a $75,000 advance for the rights to publish The Teacher's Gift, a story of believing in others. I couldn't believe it. Not only was Mr. Harrison's story going to be published, but I was going to be paid for writing it. The advance was enough to give me financial security for the first time in my adult life. But the real reward came when I received the first bound copy of the book. Seeing Mr. Harrison's story, our story, in print, felt like the ultimate validation of everything he'd taught me about the power of words and the importance of telling stories that matter. The book was published in September, almost a year after Mr. Harrison's death. The launch party was held at a bookstore in Lincoln Park, not far from his old house. David Harrison was there, along with many of Mr. Harrison's former colleagues and students. As I stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd of people who'd been touched by Mr. Harrison's life, I felt his presence more strongly than I had since his funeral. "This book exists because Robert Harrison believed in the power of stories," I said. "He believed that every person has something important to say, and that it's our job to listen to each other and lift each other up." He spent his life proving that belief in others can change the world, one student at a time. The book received positive reviews and found its audience among educators, students, and anyone who'd ever had a teacher who'd made a difference in their lives. I was invited to speak at education conferences, teacher training programs, and book clubs across the country. But the most meaningful response came from teachers themselves. I received hundreds of letters from educators who said the book had reminded them why they'd chosen their profession, who said it had inspired them to see their students through Mr. Harrison's eyes. One letter, from a high school English teacher in Detroit, particularly moved me. I've been teaching for 25 years, and I was starting to feel burned out. Your book reminded me that what we do as teachers matters more than test scores or evaluation reports. It reminded me that sometimes the most important thing we can do is believe in a kid when they don't believe in themselves. Thank you for telling this story. As I sat in my apartment, now a larger one-bedroom that I could afford thanks to my salary and book advance, reading letters like this one, I finally understood what Mr. Harrison had been trying to teach me all along. We all have the power to change lives, to offer hope, to believe in others when they can't believe in themselves. The success of the book led to other opportunities. I was promoted to senior feature writer at the Sun-Times, and I started working on a second book about the power of community and human connection. I also began volunteering at a literacy center, working with adult learners who were trying to improve their reading and writing skills. One evening, while I was helping a woman named Rosa practice writing a letter to her granddaughter, I realized that I was doing exactly what Mr. Harrison had done for me all those years ago. I was seeing potential where others might see problems, believing in someone when they'd stopped believing in themselves. You have a gift for this, I told Rosa as she finished her letter. Your granddaughter is going to treasure this. Rosa smiled, the same smile I'd probably had when Mr. Harrison first told me I could be a writer. You really think so? I know so, I said, and I meant it. As I drove home that night, I thought about the ripple effects of belief and encouragement. Mr. Harrison had believed in me, I was believing in Rosa, and Rosa would go on to believe in her granddaughter. It was a beautiful cycle that could continue indefinitely, touching lives in ways we might never fully understand. The book had been out for 6 months when I received a call from David Harrison. Sarah, I have something I think you'll want to see, he said. I was going through some of Uncle Robert's papers and I found something he wrote about you just before he died. We met at a coffee shop near the Sun-Times building, and David handed me a handwritten letter dated just 2 weeks before Mr. Harrison's death. My dear Sarah, it began, I'm writing this because I want you to know how proud I am of the woman you've become. I know you think you disappointed me by leaving Northwestern, by not following the path we originally planned. But I want you to understand that you followed exactly the path you were meant to follow. You chose love over ambition when you left school to care for your mother. You chose resilience over despair when you kept writing, despite the rejections. You chose authenticity over success when you wrote about your real experiences instead of trying to write what you thought people wanted to hear. These choices made you the writer you are today. They gave you the empathy, the insight, and the voice that will allow you to touch countless lives with your words. I couldn't be more proud of you if you were my own daughter. I hope that someday, when you're ready, you'll find a way to tell our story. Not because it's extraordinary, but because it's ordinary. Because it shows that the simple act of believing in someone can change everything. Keep writing, my dear girl. The world needs your voice. With love and endless pride, Robert Harrison. By the time I finished reading, I was crying openly in the coffee shop. David reached across the table and squeezed my hand. He knew, David said softly. He knew you were going to be okay. That night, I sat at Mr. Harrison's desk, now my desk, and began working on my next article for the Sun-Times. It was about the literacy center where I volunteered, about the adult learners who were discovering the power of words later in life. As I wrote, I thought about Mr. Harrison's final letter, about his belief that our story was worth telling because it was ordinary. He was right. The most powerful stories aren't about extraordinary people doing impossible things. They're about ordinary people finding the courage to believe in themselves and in each other. I finished the article just as the sun was coming up over Lake Michigan. As I saved the document and prepared to send it to my editor, I felt Mr. Harrison's presence one more time. Thank you, I whispered to the empty apartment. Thank you for believing in me. And somewhere, in whatever place he'd gone to next, I knew he was smiling. 2 years after the book's publication, I was standing in front of a classroom full of high school students at Jefferson High School, the same school where Mr. Harrison had taught me, the same school where our story had begun. The principal, Mrs. Rodriguez, had invited me to speak to the students about writing and following your dreams, and I'd accepted immediately. The classroom looked almost exactly the same as it had 15 years ago. The same fluorescent lights, the same worn desk, the same inspirational posters on the walls. But the students were different, more diverse, more connected to technology, facing challenges that my generation couldn't have imagined. How many of you like to write? I asked the class of 30 juniors and seniors. A few hands went up tentatively, and I smiled. Come on, be honest. How many of you have ever written a song, a poem, a story, or even just a really good text message that made someone laugh? More hands went up, and I saw some of the students smiling. That's what I thought. You're all writers. You just might not know it yet. I spent the next hour talking to them about my journey from their seats to where I stood now. I told them about Mr. Harrison, about the power of having someone believe in you, about the importance of finding your own voice and using it to tell stories that matter. After my presentation, a young Latina girl named Elena approached me. She was probably 16, with long dark hair and intelligent eyes that reminded me of myself at that age. Ms. Mitchell, she said hesitantly, I really liked what you said about writing. I've been keeping a journal for years, and I write poems sometimes, but I never thought it could be anything more than just a hobby. I felt a familiar flutter of recognition. Can I see some of your work? Elena pulled out a worn notebook and showed me a few of her poems. They were raw, honest, and powerful. Exactly the kind of writing that comes from real experience and genuine emotion. Elena, these are beautiful, I said, and I meant it. You have a real gift for capturing emotion and painting pictures with words. Her face lit up. Really? You think so? I know so. Have you ever considered submitting your work to literary magazines? Or maybe entering writing contests? She shook her head. I wouldn't know where to start. And besides, nobody in my family has ever done anything like that. My parents work in factories, and they want me to study something practical. I heard echoes of my own story in her words. Can I tell you something? My mother worked 2 jobs just to keep us afloat, and nobody in my family had ever gone to college. But I had a teacher who saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. He helped me believe that I could do more than what everyone expected. I reached into my bag and pulled out a business card. I want you to email me some of your work. I know some people who might be interested in reading it. Elena took the card with trembling hands. You would really do that for me? It's not doing something for you, I said. It's doing something with you. That's what Mr. Harrison taught me. We all have the power to lift each other up. Over the next few weeks, Elena emailed me more of her work, and I was consistently impressed by her talent and her unique perspective. She wrote about growing up in a bilingual household, about the challenges of being a first-generation American, about the dreams and struggles of her community. I forwarded some of her pieces to Marcus Thompson at the Sun-Times, who was always looking for fresh voices and new perspectives. He was impressed enough to offer Elena an internship in the features department during her summer break. I can't believe this is really happening, Elena said when I called to give her the news. Are you sure I'm ready for something like this? You'll never feel completely ready, I told her. But that's okay. The important thing is that you're willing to try. Elena's internship at the Sun-Times was a huge success. She wrote articles about issues affecting young people in Chicago, and her work was so impressive that Marcus offered her a part-time position during her senior year of high school. But Elena's story was just one of many. Since the book's publication, I'd been contacted by dozens of teachers, students, and writers who'd been inspired by Mr. Harrison's story. I'd started a small scholarship fund in his name, helping students from low-income families pursue their dreams of becoming writers. I'd also begun mentoring young writers, just as Mr. Harrison had mentored me. I worked with high school students, college students, and even some adults who were trying to change careers. Each person I worked with reminded me of the responsibility that comes with believing in others. One of my mentees was a young man named Marcus, not the editor, but a different Marcus, who'd grown up in foster care and was trying to write about his experiences. Another was a middle-aged woman named Carol, who'd always dreamed of writing novels, but had never had the confidence to try. Each mentoring relationship was different, but they all taught me something about the power of encouragement and the importance of seeing potential where others might see problems. "You're becoming quite the teacher yourself," David Harrison observed one evening when we met for dinner. We'd become close friends over the years, and he often joked that I was carrying on his uncle's legacy. "I never thought about it that way," I said, "but I suppose you're right. I'm just trying to do what he did for me." "That's exactly what he did," David said. "He just tried to pass on what other teachers had done for him. It's a beautiful cycle." David was right. I'd learned that Mr. Harrison had been inspired by his own high school English teacher, a woman named Mrs. Patterson, who'd encouraged him to pursue education as a career. She'd been inspired by her college professor, and so on. The chain of influence stretched back through generations, each teacher and mentor adding their own link to the chain. As my career continued to flourish, I never forgot the lessons Mr. Harrison had taught me. I wrote articles that gave voice to people who might otherwise be ignored. I told stories that highlighted the power of human connection and the importance of believing in others. One of my most successful pieces was a series about adult literacy programs in Chicago. I spent months interviewing students and teachers, documenting the challenges and triumphs of people who were learning to read and write later in life. The series won a regional journalism award, and I was invited to give a speech at the award ceremony. As I stood at the podium, looking out at an audience of journalists, editors, and community leaders, I thought about Mr. Harrison and how proud he would have been. "Journalism at its best is about giving people a voice," I said in my speech. "It's about seeing the humanity in every story and believing that every person has something important to contribute to the conversation. That's what I try to do with every article I write, and that's what I hope to continue doing for the rest of my career." After the ceremony, a young reporter approached me. "Ms. Mitchell, I just wanted to say that your work has been really inspiring to me. I'm just starting out in journalism, and sometimes I wonder if I'm making a difference." I smiled, remembering how I'd felt when I was just starting out. "You are making a difference," I told him. "Every story you tell matters. Every voice you amplify has value. Don't ever forget that." 3 years after the book's publication, I received a call that would change my life in an unexpected way. It was from the superintendent of Chicago Public Schools. "Ms. Mitchell, I've been following your work and I have a proposition for you," she said. "We're starting a new program to bring professional writers into our schools to work with students. We're looking for someone to head up the program, and I think you'd be perfect for the job." The position would involve working with students across the district, training teachers in creative writing techniques, and developing curriculum that would help students find their voices through writing. "It would be a significant change from journalism," the superintendent continued, "but I think it's a natural evolution of the work you're already doing." I was intrigued, but uncertain. "Can I think about it?" "Of course. Take all the time you need." I spent the next few weeks weighing the decision. I loved my work at the Sun-Times, and I'd built a successful career there. But the idea of working directly with students, of being in classrooms every day, was appealing in a way I hadn't expected. I called David to discuss the opportunity. "What do you think Uncle Robert would have said?" I asked. David laughed. "Are you kidding? He'd be thrilled. He always said that teaching was the most important work anyone could do. He'd probably say this is what you've been preparing for all along." I realized David was right. Everything I'd learned as a journalist, how to listen to people, how to find the story in any situation, how to help others express themselves clearly, would serve me well in the classroom. I accepted the position and started working for Chicago Public Schools in the fall. My first day was at Jefferson High School, in the same classroom where Mr. Harrison had taught me all those years ago. The current English teacher, Ms. Williams, had graciously agreed to let me use the room for my writing workshops. As I stood at the front of the classroom, looking out at a new generation of students, I felt Mr. Harrison's presence more strongly than I had since his funeral. "Good morning, everyone," I said to the class of sophomores. "My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm here to talk to you about the power of your own voices." I saw the same mixture of curiosity and skepticism that I'd probably shown Mr. Harrison all those years ago. Some students were engaged, others were clearly wishing they were somewhere else. "Let me start by telling you a story," I said. "It's about a girl who grew up not far from here, who thought she had nothing important to say, and who had a teacher who helped her discover that she was wrong." As I told them my story, about Mr. Harrison, about the journey from their seats to where I stood now, I saw something shift in their faces. The skeptical expressions softened, and I could see them beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, their stories mattered too. Over the course of the semester, I worked with hundreds of students across the district. I taught them about different forms of writing, helped them find their unique voices, and encouraged them to share their stories with the world. But more than that, I tried to do what Mr. Harrison had done for me. I tried to see the potential in each student, to believe in them when they couldn't believe in themselves, and to help them understand that their voices had value. One of my students, a quiet boy named James, wrote a powerful essay about growing up with a father who struggled with addiction. Another student, a girl named Aisha, wrote poetry about the challenges of being a Muslim teenager in America. A student named Carlos wrote about his dreams of becoming the first person in his family to go to college. Each piece of writing was a window into a young person's life, and I felt privileged to be trusted with their stories. "You're a natural at this, Miss Gyo," Williams told me one afternoon as we watched students working on their latest assignment. "You have the same gift that Mr. Harrison had. You can see the potential in every kid." I thought about that comment as I drove home that evening. I had become the teacher I'd never planned to be, but it felt right in a way that surprised me. I was continuing Mr. Harrison's work, passing on his lessons to a new generation. That night, I sat at my desk, Mr. Harrison's desk, and began working on my second book. This one would be about the students I'd been working with, about the power of giving young people a voice and encouraging them to share their stories. As I wrote, I thought about the circle of influence that had brought me to this point. Mr. Harrison had believed in me. I was believing in my students, and they would go on to believe in others. The circle would continue, growing wider with each generation. I paused in my writing and looked at the framed photo on my desk, the same photo of Mr. Harrison and me from my high school graduation that had sat in his study. I'd asked David if I could have it, and he'd given it to me gladly. "Thank you," I whispered to the photo. "Thank you for believing in me, for never giving up on me, for showing me that the most important thing we can do is believe in each other." As I returned to my writing, I felt a deep sense of peace. I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. Mr. Harrison's legacy lived on, not just in the book I'd written about him, but in every student I taught, every young writer I mentored, every person who learned to believe in themselves because someone had believed in them first. The story that had begun with a grieving student sitting in the back row of a funeral had become something much larger, a testament to the power of human connection, the importance of believing in others, and the beautiful way that one person's faith in another can ripple outward through generations. Mr. Harrison had taught me that everyone has a story worth telling. Now it was my turn to teach others the same lesson, to help them find their voices and share their stories with the world. The circle continues, and it always will.